Welcome to Rebecca Sounds Reveille. Today is a very important show because we're going to be talking about something that millions of Americans struggle with across not only the United States, but I should say not just Americans, people across the globe. People struggle with addiction and recovery throughout the world. And there are so many different types of addictions that people have. And there's also so many different types of recoveries. Maybe you can think of a few yourself. You have everything from some of the things that first come to mind, such as alcoholism or drug addiction, but there's also shopping and other types of addictions. It can even be eating or another type of compulsive behavior. And so we're going to talk about that today. Here's a challenge, though, that many people who have some type of addiction, come to the table with, and that is when they want to seek treatment, they're not sure what type of recovery options are available to them. And there are a number of different views in this particular arena. So we want to address those different things today, the two specifically, addiction and recovery. With me today, I have someone who is absolutely phenomenal in his knowledge and his background with this particular topic. And he has two businesses that he runs, not to mention a number of other things. One of the businesses he has is Seeing True. He also has Progressive Recovery. And these are resources that are dedicated to exploring concepts of engaging, releasing, and transcending blockages that are in our lives. This is really important. Why is that? Because we can get to one stage and there is something blocking us from moving to the next stage. We can't really move forward. And a lot of times when people are struggling with addiction, there is a lot of times they go back to using. There's also terms for this, and we're going to talk about those today. But not only that, with me today, my guest is also author of a book that is based on a true story about an author's interaction with a serial killer and death row. It's called The Killer's Grace. He is also a speaker. He is a facilitator. And I would have to definitely say this man is an expert in the topic that we are going to be speaking about today. With me today is Ron Chapman. Welcome to the show, Ron.
Thank you, Rebecca. Tickled to be with you.
I am delighted too, because you just have so many amazing things that you've done. This particular topic, though, I think is very difficult for people to talk about, and it doesn't get spoken of often enough. What do you think?
Well, we still have a huge legacy of shame around
Yes.
addiction. It's still viewed to be some kind of a moral failing. The evidence is really, really strong that we're really dealing with things that are biochemical in nature, behavioral in nature, deep behavioral. But the original imprint for drunkenness and addiction and debauchery and all those things, I mean, there's a very, very strong shame-based perspective on it. And so still to this day, despite the many advances, people are very, very reticent to even speak of it, much less acknowledge that it's their problem.
Mm-hmm. I have to agree with you. And I think that the society we live in as a whole has come to the point where a lot of people don't take ownership for a lot of problems. But in this particular arena, we're now even seeing so many other things, including prescription addiction, in higher rates than we've ever seen before. And I think, go ahead.
Yeah, the opioid crisis is it is substantial,
Mm-hmm.
and of course fueled by all kinds of things in the prescription drug arena that really got a lot of that launched and have caused people to become opiate addicted and to chase opiates outside of prescription drugs. And so one of my clients actually does a lot of work nationally and internationally on the opiate addiction problem, and it's very concerning, Rebecca.
I have to agree with you. It is very concerning. And from what I know, as a retired peace officer, and from things that I've seen, researched on, and spoken to with hundreds of people, it can carry over from a prescription addiction to an illicit, illegal street drug addiction, such as heroin, because they cannot obtain the things after countless times of trying to obtain prescription, even by doctor jumping, that they will end up turning to the streets to get to that. But there's so much to talk about with this. I think we first have to establish for the audience what an addiction really is and how it works in the brain.
Sure. Well, that's a really interesting and emerging field. So many people are intrigued by what happens, but in short, there does seem to be a genetic predisposition. Some would argue with that, but there's also clearly an overlay into family systems and early childhood exposure to any number of things.
Sure.
And so, you could argue till the cows come home about whether it's nature or nurture, and I don't know that we'll ever answer that question. We can acknowledge they're both there. And we do see a very high incidence of it repeating in families that have addictive histories, even when it skips generations. It's not uncommon to have people wonder where the addiction problem came from. Their parents don't drink, don't drug, etc. But then they'll do some family research, and it turns out their parents don't drink and drug because their grandparents had problems. So there's something that has transferred epigenetically through to the next generation, and that's usually a great surprise. So it literally, and I know a lot of people hate this, blaming the genes and all that, but we need to acknowledge that it's not simply a matter of will and free choice where addiction is concerned.
I have to agree with you. The research is emerging that, and I'm going to use this as an example, because when you talk about these particular substance, when it comes to substances, that they're basically chemicals, right? So we're finding now that just chemicals that like glyphosate, that it actually goes into the genes and changes the DNA structure. So if this is a chemical, any one of the substances that you can think of, that would only make sense that it is genetic, and it can skip generations. So I would have to agree with you on this, in that from this viewpoint, I would definitely say, based on everything that we're finding, that has to be there, because you can talk to some people who can try a certain substance and have no reaction of that desire that becomes so overwhelming to them, and they can just take it or leave it. And you have someone else who, as soon as they partake of it, they then feel that yearning to have it more. So I'm going to definitely agree with you on this.
Yeah, and all you have to do is spend a little time talking with people who will share their recovery stories, and you'll hear things like, honestly, one of the ones that profoundly affected me was a woman I was doing some recovery-related work with, and her story was that at the age of 8 years old, her grandfather put her on her knee and gave her a few sips of Schlitz malt liquor.
And wow.
We can argue about whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea.
Right.
But come on. Well, within a matter of 2 years, by the age of 10 or 11, she was daily stealing liquor from her parents' liquor cabinet and replacing it with water. She was watering down the liquors. And you have to say to yourself, when you look at something like that, 8 years old to full-blown alcoholic by 11, you just have to say to yourself that there's something going on there that we don't understand well, that it's not like an 8-year-old makes up their mind they're going to become an alcohol-seeking fiend.
Right.
And so clearly that's an extreme example of a very small amount of alcohol triggering some kind of a significant biochemical response, which created a craving. And once the craving kicked in, she became alcohol-seeking, which then led, if we follow her story, then it led to street drugs, Eventually, she ended up being a junkie, and it all started with these seemingly harmless sips of Schlitz malt liquor. And it's a true story. I've validated, and it really challenges us to think much more differently about this addiction problem. That it's not simply, as I say, a matter of choosing or not choosing.
Right. And I do think, like I said, I really agree with that based on the research that is evolving now. And I do think also there are environmental contributors, what you're seeing in your household, because patterns repeat themselves. The home is the boot camp for children. That's what they see is what they emulate, right? So
Yeah.
there's all of that. And then you have peer pressure, so on and so forth. But really to have that, you question that, it's just a very interesting thing. The other thing on addiction is that people also have similar desires and compulsions when it comes to a substance issue and not having that issue, but maybe shopping or overeating.
Yeah. So if you really study this for a while, Rebecca, what you find is we're such a judgmental species. It's like, well, I can stop drinking. Why can't you? But let's don't talk about my shopping addiction, or, I don't have a drug seeking problem, but let's don't talk about my gambling addiction.
Yes,
And this is going to drive a few people crazy. I know when I say this, but when we look at relational addiction patterns,
yes.
I mean, a whole pattern of domestic violence. We find a lot of repeat behavior, which certainly looks a lot like the same kind of pattern.
Correct.
In the research now around codependency, they talk a lot about love addiction, relationship addiction, sex addiction.
Yes.
The thing that they all seem to have in common has to do with the neuroreceptors in our brains.
Okay.
I mean, that's really what it sort of comes down to.
Yes. The common thread is neuroreceptors.
The common thread is neuroreceptors in the brain. And it turns out that some of us are more susceptible to certain things and some of us aren't susceptible to any things. There's some interesting research going on up at the University of Buffalo. They're trying to understand what it is that causes people who get a healthy attachment to exercise. Mm-hmm. What's different about a healthy attachment to exercise versus those who use the same chemical bonds to establish an unhealthy relationship to food. So they're trying to,
interesting.
Like, it's the same neuroreceptors. There's something going on there, and yet someone will attach pleasure, satisfaction, etc., to potato chips, and someone else will attach it to running 5 miles.
Right.
And they're trying to understand what is it that's going on there at the neurotransmitter level, because there's clearly something that we don't understand.
Mm-hmm. This is absolutely fascinating, and I think one thing we really need to lay a foundation here for the audience is that regardless of what type of addiction that someone has, that there is help for it, and that it isn't something to be ashamed of.
Well, easier said than done. Because
I agree.
Remember, shame is something we carry within us. We aren't even aware. But, one of the things that's been really wonderful in recent years, and this is a very controversial subject in the recovering community, is the number of people who are now freely acknowledging that they have an addiction problem. It's actually fairly common now. I mean, the beautiful piece of it is that what we're doing is we're normalizing it. It's becoming, I'm in recovery 31 years now, and I rarely hear somebody condemn me for that now. Not so much 31 years ago. It's clearly changed. And at the same time, we've still got a lot of societal feedback mechanisms that do continue to shame, especially a lot of our community level interrelationships, certainly a lot of our faith communities have long ethical and moral positions which are at odds with people coming out. And the reason it's so controversial is because a lot of the foundational recovery work, going back to the 12-step programs, really emphasized anonymity. And the two main reasons for that. One was because it was so unsafe to acknowledge that you had a problem. The other is that the relapse rate was so terrible with the typical addict that they didn't want anybody being the voice for something and then having a blast off in full public view because it would give the recovery programs a bad name. So it's a very conflicted space where anonymity for people's safety and everything else. And at the same time, there seems to be a great deal of value in talking honestly about it because it normalizes it. It makes it okay for more people.
That's very interesting to think about. And do you think when it's normalized then that people tend less to steer in recovery?
Well, there's a couple of interesting things that happen, Rebecca. The one that has intrigued me most lately is stigma.
Okay.
Now, interestingly enough, and it's true about substance abuse, it's true about any number of things. I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. What we know now about stigma is you actually can't educate people away from stigma. It's just not.
Okay.
But what you can do is put people in contact with people like me. And the contact, because I'm a decent person and they interact, they find out I'm human, it dissolves a lot of the stigma associated with me being a recovering person.
I see. Okay.
Same thing they've learned about mental illness. The best way to get over your fear of mental illness is to hang out with people with mental illness. The best way to get over homophobia is when you find out that your cousin who you love is gay.
Right.
The best way to stop judging the addicts is when you find out that your sibling is an addict and you've loved them their whole life.
Right.
So contact dissolves stigma. The research is pretty solid on this. And so the fact that more of us speak openly about it is in fact promoting more of us to come out of the shadows and to be honest about what we're facing, which is a remarkable thing.
It is remarkable, and I think it's extremely important and very healthy. I think that the more alone someone feels, the greater risk they have to self-harm.
Yeah, the shame loop, what we know pretty clearly is that one of the things that fuels the propensity to go looking for the expression of the addiction is when we begin to feel shame, that something's wrong with us. That discomfort causes people to want to seek even more solace in the drug of their choice, if you will.
Right.
And so, yeah, the whole normalization of the shame loop, making it okay for me and you to have whatever problems we have. So much of the recovering world is about people talking honestly about what they've done and who they are and where they are with these things. And to the degree that it's received with non-judgment, it makes it okay to have a problem. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just think that is so important because everybody has some kind of a problem. There is no one immune from a problem. Yeah. It's just, how do you become healthy from that and begin to move forward so you don't feel that whatever it is that's troubling you has that much control over you where you can't make healthy choices or have a healthy life?
Yeah, I was going exactly the same place. The thing that I've often marveled about is, and I mentioned it obliquely a moment ago, is our propensity to compare ourselves to others. So someone might say to me, well, I don't have an alcohol problem. Why do you? Rather than making the cross comparison to other human problems. For example, comparing your overeating problem with my alcoholism is a fairer comparison.
Yes.
Or comparing perhaps relationship addiction, which is quite prevalent in the culture, and understanding that it too has its own destructive expressions, and then saying, oh, well, my problem isn't alcohol, but my problem is fill in the blank.
Right.
And the part that really stretches people, Rebecca, is when we start talking about addictive relationships to things that are perceived to be healthy.
That is true. That is very true.
I know this sounds crazy, but I know a couple of people who are in recovery from exercise addictions, which is related to food addictions. They used exercise to deal with their food addictions. And it's still destructive, even though it's a healthy behavior because of the dynamics it sets up.
Very true. And on the flip side of that, Ron, is that there's eating disorders that are associated on the opposite extreme when it comes to consumption of some type of food or lack thereof.
Right. And I borderline on that. I was talking with my physician one day, and she, because I'm 60 years old, almost 61, I'm having to pay attention to metabolic rate and cholesterol and all those things common to middle age. And she was talking to me, and she said, well, maybe when you snack in the evening, you should eat cauliflower or something. And I just laughed. She said, well, why are you laughing? I go, well, I do eat cauliflower. I can eat a lot of cauliflower. She said, you can binge on cauliflower? And I said, oh my God, I can binge on anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the dynamic. And of course, binging on cauliflower doesn't have the deleterious effects of binging on fried chicken or whatever, but it has the same psychological reinforcing pattern.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the substance, it's not the process we're addicted to, it's the destructive effects it's having on us that's the problem.
Yes, I have to agree. And so that kind of moves us into a number of different modalities that people have to recover from whatever type of addiction that they're facing. So some of the things people do is you need to quit cold turkey.
Yep. Yeah, I think that historically the one that is certainly talked about most is associated with the 12-step recovery programs, oftentimes preceded with some kind of a detox or inpatient treatment, because a lot of that thankfully has been medicalized because people would die from the detox process itself. So we commonly know about the 12-step recovery programs, which pretty much address all the addictions. Increasingly, there is interest in psychopharmacological interventions.
Okay, let's stop right there for just a second, Ron, because I'm wondering, since we're talking about the psychological aspect of it on this particular point, in that if they have it in the psychopharmacological area, then what about behavior, cognitive behavioral therapy? Is that something else that's being utilized?
Well, some would argue it's been successful.
Okay.
A lot of my observation is that one of the mistakes we make, Rebecca, is we don't understand that addiction occurs on a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
The example I was using of the woman who was off to the races at 8 years old, she was on an extreme end of the addictive cycle. She was highly addictive.
Right.
There are people who, they're in the mid-range, and there are people who are only perhaps mildly addictive.
Mm-hmm.
So what we might probably argue is that some of those who are on the lesser intensity end of the spectrum, that maybe there really are behavioral interventions that are going to work for them.
Okay.
For the woman I was telling you about, the evidence would seem to suggest that a behavioral intervention for her is probably not a good strategy.
Right. Oh, absolutely it does. And I'm thinking, with going back to what you said at the beginning of the show here in the neuro-receptors, that, I'm just wondering, and maybe you could explain this to the audience, has to do also with endorphins, correct?
Yeah, serotonin and
Okay.
beta endorphins. And one of the hypotheses that is pretty strong, there's actually a woman named Kathleen Desmassons who has done a bunch of work on addictive brain nutrition.
Okay.
And her contention, based on her research, she's a PhD researcher, her contention is that people who are prone to addiction have a low uptake of serotonin and I forget the other neurotransmitter. And that the result is that the key brain chemicals that make you feel well don't occur enough. And so because you don't feel well, because your sense of yourself is low, say mildly depressed perhaps, your pain tolerance is low because enough beta endorphins aren't getting crossed to from the blood-brain barrier.
Okay.
Then people start looking for something to give them a boost. Now, the killer in the dynamic, according to her research, is that if you withdraw the substances, the neuroreceptors looking for it increase in number.
Okay.
So you are more primed than ever for an addictive response. Okay. So let's say you start with, I don't know, 1 billion neurotransmitter receptors. And you begin to restrict the amount of the substance that you're hooked on, what will happen is, because the brain wants more of it, is it will create 1.25 billion receptors looking for more of the substance, which makes it more likely that if the substance gets into your body, you're going to want even more fast.
Correct. And so, I'm just thinking that's what causes a lot of, unfortunately, people who end up in the end result of not making it because they end up overindulging in whatever substance it is, whether it's heroin or prescriptions or whatever the case may be. But something else I find very fascinating about what you said is serotonin. And many people are thinking about serotonin in relation to sleep. And so when that's the case, if you're not getting enough of that, that kind of goes back to what you said about getting that energetic level. So you're feeling, you would obviously feel depressed and you would feel tired and you're looking for that boost. And that can even be going to add another addiction to all of this is caffeine, because there are some people who just thrive on caffeine, right? I mean, anything, it seems like, right? But it's important to really understand this, because if we don't, we're making these assumptions, that stigma is there, and then people really can't truly get the type of recovery that they need. Now, out of all of the modalities that you have, been doing research on and that you have worked with people on, what do you find to be the most successful for most people, or is there not one, it's more individualistic?
Well, the data is growing that we should look for more psychopharmacological interventions that that in the hands of a good, what's typically called an addictionologist, someone who has a psychiatric degree, but they specialize in addictive brain chemistry, addictive process. In the hands of a good addictionologist, someone who really knows what they're doing, there's some pretty strong evidence that's emerging that that's actually a better intervention than what you labeled as the cold turkey, the 12-step way. Now, the 12-step folks would profess that to be heretical. They believe profoundly in this spiritual psychic change, something that was the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous, which started the whole 12-step thing.
Right.
And so abstinence is generally a given in that community. And it has a good track record. There's an increasing presence of sober living communities.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of work being done that suggests that what we're lacking is connection, human connection. And so the sober living communities are about establishing enduring relationships and connection. Some might call it, which produces the good feelings and the commitment with others that helps you live sober in ways that don't include alcohol, drugs, etc. There are some things that get a little stretchier by some accounts. There's a fair amount of evidence that what we would broadly label mindfulness practices can be very, very helpful. Mindfulness, I think, at its most fundamental, allows us to learn how to be with ourselves. So when we experience some distress, we can go to our mindfulness practices and be with ourselves, which can allow us to overcome. And then there's some more extreme examples, two in particular, which are traditional shamanic practices. One is ibogaine out of Africa. And there's ayahuasca, South American potion, tea. And what they're saying about those is that they literally rewire the neural pathways in the brain.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it does something that rewires literally the way these things flow in the brain. And there are quite a few stories. I don't know the research very well, but there are quite a few stories of people who, by practicing these things, overcome their addictions and live addiction-free.
And these are administered by shaman?
Yes, generally, a little bit off the radar screen. Actually kind of hard to track down because some of these are considered banned substances and all that. But
Okay.
some of the people I've talked to, they swear by it, that it has really transformed them. And then one other that I suspect it may prove to be near and dear to your heart, given your background as a veteran and so forth, is that there's a lot of evidence that childhood trauma is implicated in addiction. If you take a child and expose them, and it's a little different from PTSD as we would know it from wartime, but the data is mounting that shows lots of deleterious effects on children exposed to low-grade violence, low-grade poverty, low-grade lack, etc., hunger, and the like. And that the evidence would suggest pretty strongly that children exposed to trauma, to stress, they're labeling it, have an increased incidence of substance abuse problems. And some, one teacher I'm familiar with, argues that all addictions begin with some kind of childhood neglect, abuse, abandonment, or betrayal, is her contention, that's the original trauma that addicts experience.
Very interesting. I don't know that I would agree with that on 100% level. I would say on a high level, based on what I know, yes, that is definitely the case, because people are seeking to find the love that they weren't getting at home or didn't recover from. So I would definitely say that. I know that there is a number of other factors, though, as well, and one that we talked about at the top of the show, and that is genetic. And again, based on the research that's being uncovered now, it just doesn't seem like a lot of people would realize that the connection is there. And if you can look at me, and I'm going to use this just as a quick example. And I have red hair. No one else in my family has it. Maybe a couple of genes ago, but I'm it. So that's very, very interesting how it can change. And so there could be skepticism there and saying, well, maybe you're not really from the same two parents, and there was an ongoing joke when I was a kid, you're the milkman's kid, But genetically, I have a cousin who now their siblings came out with completely different hair, and he came out a redhead. So it's obviously in the genes somewhere. So I think just even more so with the chemicals that are being added, and then we're not even thinking about the combined chemicals that are becoming part of our system, and how those when you talk about a scientist putting two things into and there you get this explosion, you don't know what the mix is going to be, and we've got more and more things that we're exposed to, and things that we're just beginning to understand that our ancestors were exposed to as well. So based on what though, I'm wondering what you have found when you are assisting people with these types, and you've had some very extreme cases. The success rate, is there a certain percentage, or maybe you can't divulge that right now, or what, again, are some other really good treatment methods, or what would you suggest, I know this is a three-part question here, to the audience on where they should start? Where should I start?
Well, so I guess the first thing I'll say is that the best data I've seen, and there may be better data, but the best data I've seen proposes that about 1 in 6 people, once they've established a full-blown addiction, about 1 in 6 will achieve long-term recovery.
Very interesting. Okay.
Now, some would really like to say, especially with some of the newer psychopharmacological interventions, they're really saying it's much higher than that, but I don't know if they've been tested long enough. I mean, I would fully expect we would improve upon it. But the things that I now look for, and I'll be very personal on a piece of this. I have 2 daughters. They're adults now, and I knew the family system they came out of, and so I knew there was some possibility. And so when they were about 12, 13, 14, I started telling them the one hard truth I think we all need to hear. The only way you find out is if you have addiction, is if you do something enough to get addicted and find out you can't quit.
Right.
Now, that's not an idle threat. It's an acknowledgement. And this is what I told my daughters is, so you need to be very, very careful. You need
Yes.
to know that the only way you will find out is if you get hooked on something. And then unfortunately, the data doesn't say it will be easy for you to get done because you'll be hooked.
Right. Right.
And so we have to start from that. We have to talk plainly with people and stop minimizing the problem. It's a lot of the things that we consider to be normal youth, young adult behavior are actually, they may be common, but that doesn't mean they're normal.
Very
Um,
true. Very
Propensity
true.
to binge drinking, experimental drug use, all the sorts of things and I mean, I was one of those kids who did that, so I'm very aware of all the almost hypocrisy of saying that, but we need to talk openly.
Mm-hmm.
What I have found as one of the best preventative treatments in our culture is to be forthcoming about these things, which is why I'm pleased to be talking with you about it, Rebecca. It's like you put it out there so that people understand it better and stop thinking that it's a moral issue. And then we encounter the next part, which is the most, I think, from a family point of view, the ones who love us the most problematic, is we really have to wrestle with the fact that many of us enable addictive behavior.
Oh, that is so true. I think you
Right?
have hit in on something that most of us do not want to acknowledge.
Right.
Oh
We
my
want to
goodness.
just blame the addict, which then relieves us of any culpability.
Very true.
And this is I've worked with a lot of people working with loved ones with various addictions. And one of the most painful parts is in understanding that what we believe is protecting them may actually be sustaining their addiction.
This is
Uh,
true. And I want to just kind of interject here
mhm.
because I'm thinking about this. We don't want to see them going through detox, or we don't want to see
Right.
certain things, and so we enable it, and then it gets to the point where they end up on one of these, and I really don't want to say too much negative, but a show where you have
Yeah.
familial problems on there, and one of the people in the family have this addiction, and they're talking about all of these things that they've done and what they do to get
Mhm.
X, Y, and Z drug or whatever the case may be. And then that parent or loved one is saying, well, I want to stop doing that, but I can't. Or
Right.
when it's time to do tough love, it's so difficult, and the relationship then crumbles, even though it was
Mhm.
already kind of there.
Yeah.
Um, but it is so devastating that they end up
Mhm.
not knowing what to do.
Right, and I mean, my heart breaks for this because it is so hard. I had
Yes.
a guy call me just recently. He tracked me down, and he was trying to figure out what he was going to do with his dad. His dad is a drinker and driver. So in other words, his
Mm,
dad gets loaded, blacks out, and drives, and it's only a matter of time before he's going to T-bone someone, and we're going to end up with dead people.
right.
And he said, so what do I do? Because we've tried this and this and this. And I said, honestly, what I would do is when he leaves, call the highway patrol, tell him where he is, because first of all, we must intervene because people dying because of a drunk driver is an unacceptable
Yes.
outcome. More
Yes.
importantly, what we know is that a bottom for people, a realization, often comes because of intervention somewhere, and
Yes.
nothing better sometimes than a chance to visit your local magistrate.
It's
Uh,
very true. And I've got to tell you, being a retired peace officer, one of the
yeah,
biggest challenges when I first, got hired and I started issuing citations for moving violations or taking
yeah,
people to jail, because they were under the influence. And even though I knew that this was wrong, they need to be educated, and some people, a verbal warning will work, some people a citation will work, and some people jail time will work.
right,
But it didn't come to the forefront of really my mind until I had talked to enough people to realize that not only is it what I'm supposed to do to protect and serve society. But in essence, this might be the only road that that person is going to take to get them to where
Right.
they can be healthy. And I have had countless people over the years end up telling me, you know, Officer Rebecca, if it weren't for you, I would have continued on the same path I was on.
Yep, that is exactly the point, is that we don't know what it takes to get someone's attention.
Yes.
I guess I need to tell you this story. My dad was in stage, he was in at last stage of his life, and some of his life choices were challenging for people, and sometimes the nurses they just treated him terribly. My dad was a good man. He was a good,
Uh-huh.
hardworking, law-abiding, trying to make a go of it, and I used to get so angry at how they would treat him. Well, one day he had to be admitted again. He also had diabetes and a number of things going on. And there was a nurse that day who, I'm going to cry. She was the kindest, gentlest person I'd encountered in the medical system.
Oh,
She was so gentle with my dad. They knocked him out with whatever they did. And I just thanked her. I mean, I was so appreciative. He'd had a really bad experience with the ER staff the previous week. And I asked her about it. I said, because I'm that kind of guy, I got to ask. I said, like, what's that about? And man, she looked down, Rebecca, and she said, you're not going to believe it. And I said, well, lay it on me. She said, well, my daddy's a drunk. And
oh,
it was awful. It was awful, Ron. And one day I came home, it'd been a long shift, and Mama was crying because Daddy was drunk. And she said, I just snapped. And I went
uh-huh,
into his room, and I went into his closet, and I pulled out his revolver, and I
uh-huh,
loaded it with bullets, and I looked at him. I said, Daddy, get in the damn car. And he said, what are you doing with my gun? And she
uh-huh.
said, get in the damn car, Daddy. And he said, honey, that's my gun. She said, I know. We're going to go out onto the West Mesa. I'm going to leave you there. And I want you to blow your brains out because we are just tired of this suffering.
Oh my gosh.
And Bonnie started crying. She was so embarrassed. I hugged her. I was like, my God, no wonder she was compassionate. She understands the struggles people go through with these things. And then she looked up at me and she had this goofy, she goes, Daddy got sober because I did that.
Oh my gosh.
Right? You get it? And
Yes.
it's awful. I mean, by every standard, we would say, kind of got chills, Rebecca.
Mm-hmm.
Um, by every standard, we would say, my God, that's awful. But it got through to him, and he
Yes.
never drank again.
And by
And
no means are we encouraging any
oh
member of the
God, no,
audience to do anything like this.
no,
But the point
no.
that Ron is trying to make is that we have to be very strong in putting healthy boundaries around those who cannot make the choices to, or they cannot get to the point where they can keep the boundaries based on the things that are going on with them.
Yeah, and thanks for that. I mean, again, I'm not going to pretend to think that's a good strategy, but it is so illustrative. I mean, they'd been working around his problem for so very long, and it was breaking the family up, and it was an awful circumstance. And literally, she
Yes.
said, I just snapped. And it
Mhm.
turns out that radical intervention, which you and I would never recommend, somehow or another cut through, and he never drank again because he finally understood the consequences of what was going on, presumably.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I simultaneously love and am appalled by the story, but
Absolutely
it's
understandable. The
it's also
principle. Mhm.
it's such a measure of how devastating addiction is to families.
And that's another part. A lot of people think that their addiction affects only them, or if they are
Mm-hmm.
isolated enough that it's affecting only them. But
Mm-hmm.
every type of issue that is going on with someone really does affect somebody else down the line. It's a
Yeah.
trickle effect. I mean, when you walk into the store, it's the attitude that is presented towards the person behind you in the line or to the clerk at the register. It can be how you react to a driver on the road.
Right.
And then there's also the reaction and the devastation that it does cause, whether they believe it or not, is hurting, either because they can't be there to care for the person because they've alienated themselves, or because the family knows that by enabling them they're doing wrong, but they want to
Mhm.
maintain the closeness is so
Mhm.
as much as possible. So really, in essence, addiction, it doesn't just affect one person, and regardless of what form it is or not, it does
Mhm.
trickle, and it affects a lot of people. And then of course, if it gets to the point when we're talking about, it can actually be detrimental to other people's lives on the road, or
Yeah.
so on and so forth. I mean, it absolutely is something that needs to be done. But I really love that you have shared this part of the piece, because I think that more than anything is one of the mechanisms to get someone into one of the modalities of recovery, and that
Yeah.
is to be strong enough when the other person cannot, and get them to start looking at things. And people sometimes will say, well, I can't do anything till they hit rock bottom. That may be true, but in the interim, how about some tough love and really set the boundaries, because they cannot have those boundaries erected on their own right now.
Yeah.
And yes.
One of the things, the Al-Anon programs, which were created to help people who have loved ones with alcoholism or addictions, they talk about detachment with love.
Hmm.
We don't want to stop loving them, but we do need to find a way to distance from the effects, and so that we can make what we would call good decisions for ourselves, our families, and to do it out of love, not out of punishment, not out of
Yes.
judgment, not out of condemnation. Um, the reason even though it's one of the hardest things in the world to do, the reason I love that so much, Rebecca, is it acknowledges that one of the healing factors is to still be held in esteem by those who care about us. That if we can hold people in esteem, which doesn't mean we can't be strong, as you're saying,
Right.
it means that it's not helpful to fuel the shame loop. The typical addict feels badly enough already.
Yes,
Uh,
and a lot of people don't think that. In fact, I've had conversations with people say, "Can you believe this guy they've had? I mean, that's their fifth DUI and they're driving on a suspended. They
yeah.
don't care." But there's more to it than just that. And one of the things that I do want to share, and
Yeah.
here's a little personal thing. I knew someone very much who wanted to be involved in my world, and had an alcohol issue. And I had to tell the person, I said, I really am interested in you and interested in getting to know you more. But
Hmm.
for me, I cannot be around that.
Yeah.
And I really am interested, though, in getting to know you more, and in seeing where, things could go. I just can't. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Not much long later, the person stopped drinking.
Yeah.
That was it. And so some things motivate one person and it won't motivate somebody
Yeah.
else.
Yeah,
Um,
probably that's a reflection of why it's so important for us to just be as open and honest as we can be, especially if we sense that there's a problem. One of the things, lots of families where there's a lot of addiction, they talk about a lot of the secrecy in the family, because
yes,
they don't talk about these things. And
yes,
I completely understand, but there does seem to be something really valuable as I look at generational sobriety. There are lots of children and children of children who, by virtue of having been exposed to talking openly about substance abuse, acknowledging it's in the family system, normalizing it as a disease, not a moral failing.
right.
It's actually quite common now in the recovering world to hear people who are second, third generation recovery people who were exposed to these ideas because recovery was such an open conversation. Which I can't help, Rebecca, I just have to believe that over time, as we make it more and more acceptable, to just be honest about these things, that we can normalize it and treat it more as the condition that it is, rather than something for which people should be punished or condemned.
Yes. I want to thank you so much, Ron, for all of the information that you have shared. I've got to tell you, I am just really glad to talk in depth about both addiction and recovery and even healthy boundaries here, and allow the audience to really be able to think through these different things, whether it's for themselves, a loved one, or even someone that they're just maybe a coworker, for example. But for those of you in the audience, this is something that you really need to share to others out there as well, because they may not be telling anyone their secrecy, but really do need the assistance. Ron Chapman has been with us, and he is the creator of Seeing True and Progressive Recovery. Ron, if you'll share with the audience how they can get in contact with you and how you can assist them.
Sure, just a couple of things. If you're specifically interested in the recovery material, progressiverecovery.org. It's a lot of free content. It's just something I contribute to the world. Don't market, it's just material that's available. You can go there and learn more about this, learn more about me as well, and you can approach me there. I am heavily involved in what I would call spiritual growth and development. That's the Seeing True work, transformative work. And for me, they're very much parallel items. A lot of forgiveness work, a lot of healing work. And again, lots of free content at seeingtrue.com. People are free to check that out. And then I do have to say this, if you're really interested in the underlying psychology of this, you mentioned my book, A Killer's Grace, which is about the serial killer that I talked with that became a fictionalized treatment. The feedback I've gotten on the book, it's fiction. I'd love to talk about that some other time, but the feedback is that it treats this subject of overcoming, of reconciliation, of redemption, of healing, about as well as many books that people have found. So I'd love to have people read it, because I think it's a transformative way of viewing these sets of problems.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ron, for being on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Rebecca.
And for those of you out there, again, we do want to see that those who are in situations where they have an addiction and need recovery and are not sure where to start, this is a great opportunity for you to assist them. So please make sure that you share this video as much as possible and encourage others to share it as well. And I look forward to talking with you and bringing you more on what we need to wake up to on another episode of Rebecca Sounds Reveille. Thanks for watching.